Welcome, Stacey Brown, to the Blessings podcast this morning. I'm so excited to talk to you, Stacey. And can you just give us a little idea of who you are right now, what's going on in your life, and anything that you think we should know?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. As you said, my name is Stacey Brown. I am an intuitive healer. I am a certified Reiki practitioner. I'm a spiritual mentor and coach. I am an Akashic record reader, and I am a podcast host and creator. And in addition to that, I have my first book that is on its way. It should be any day now, released on Amazon, talking about my journey to getting to the place of being able to do this introduction. So that's a
Wow.
little bit about me. I'm a mom of four. My oldest is 25 and she's married. Then I have a son who's 21, another son who's 19, and a little girl who's still at home. She's 9. Busy life.
Wow. That is busy. It's nice to have that span with the older one that you can watch starting her life and the little one. So you still get to have that mom experience
It's
of,
a really beautiful experience because there's so much that we learn with each child, right? And having that 10-year age gap between number 3 and number 4 gave me a renewed perspective on parenting. And I
Mm.
feel like my 4th child is getting a completely different mother than the older 3 got. So I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying the age gap. I'm enjoying watching my children flourish. It's a beautiful season.
I love that. Before we go back and talk about how it all started, I just want to ask you, how do you think that you're a better mother now to the 4th child?
As I'm going to share with you in just a little bit, I've had some really powerful experiences in the last few years that have shifted my perspective and put me in more of a spiritual space. I spent a lot of years with a theme of shame and guilt
Mm.
that I didn't even have the awareness that I was carrying. And I believe that as parents, we don't necessarily realize how our programming, our upbringing impacts us. And we aimlessly try to navigate our way through parenting. Because of these events that I'm going to share, it has shifted my perspective and it has changed the way that I show up in the world. And my aha moment, and I talk about it in my book, is that I have control over one thing in this world, and that's me. I am dedicated every single day to giving my children a healthier mother today than they had yesterday.
Mm.
Because of that commitment and because of the work that I've done on myself, I believe that it has shifted the way that I'm showing up in all the ways. In the work that I do, I gave up a career, which I'll talk about. I've dedicated my life to serving others.
Mm.
And because of that, I feel that my little girl gets a better version of me than what the older ones had.
Yeah, I can feel that. So let's go back and talk about where you were born and just get a little idea of who you were as a child. Can you talk about
Absolutely.
that?
So I was born in California. I am the oldest of 3 girls. My father had been raised in the Mormon faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I was born into a family that was learning how to navigate Mormonism. And
Mm.
my parents were devout followers of the church. My father was very big in the corporate world, had a very successful career, and his entire focus was his success. When he was dropped off at college in his late teens, early 20s, his parents were homeless and living out of their station wagon. And he had a little sister and a newborn baby brother at the time. And he made a conscious decision that his family would never suffer in that way.
Mm.
So he was constantly chasing the next goal. So, though I was born in California, we actually ended up moving out to the East Coast because he landed an opportunity to be the head of technology for the Reagan administration in the White House.
Wow.
So he moved us from California to Virginia,
But that
and
was in the 80s.
it was in the
So,
80s.
okay. So how old were you in that at that time?
Gosh, when we moved to Virginia, I want to say I was in kindergarten. I was like 5.
Okay.
I remember the move, and I remember watching my dad transform into this power hungry, hyper focused chaser of his dreams. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. He had an idea in his head that he was going to chase success.
Mhm.
And so my mother was a stay-at-home mom. We definitely lived a life that was formed around the Mormon faith. And in that, it's very traditional, very patriarchal. And so my mother cared for us and took us to our activities and made sure that we were getting our homework done. And my dad, at that point, started to be more absent. I believe that he loved us, but I believe that he loved the pursuit of his career more. So we moved a lot. I've moved so many times that I can't even count at this point.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that at 5, that was the first move.
Yeah. So I lived in 2 different places in California as a very young child. And then at age 5, moved to Virginia. And then from Virginia, we ended up moving again. It was just this constant pursuit of the next corporate role that would launch my father into more success. It was something that I didn't understand as a child, but looking back on it now, I recognize a lot of it was fear-based because he had seen his parents suffer and he didn't want his own family to suffer. So his idea was the way I provide is to continue to build my success. And so
Yeah.
his career was a major focus. And it was hard to integrate him into our day-to-day life when he was around because he
Mm.
was around so infrequently.
Do you have any stories from that early time that you can remember?
What's interesting, I have little flashes of memory during that time, but my memories really become more vivid as I headed into adolescence, the preteen years, and my father's way of parenting became very abusive.
Really?
It was more verbally and mentally abusive than it was physical. I can tell you this, I can't remember a time in my childhood where I did not struggle with crippling, debilitating anxiety. There was a
Wow.
feeling of walking on eggshells, chasing perfection, feeling like I was never enough. And that was really hard because I was so young and wanted so much to do the quote right thing. But it felt like no matter what I did, there was always something wrong with what I was doing. And that absolutely followed me into adulthood and the men that I was attracted to and how I lived my life. And it absolutely started with my father.
Wow. So in the home, he was the patriarch, and you said that it was hard to integrate him into things that you did. Can you
Mhm.
think of a time when you were doing something as a family and it felt disjointed having him there?
Oh, absolutely. I was really blessed in the sense of my mother's side of the family had a grouping of homes on the
Hmm.
ocean in Maine.
Oh.
And so because my mother was a stay-at-home mom, no matter where we lived, what state we lived in, when school got out for summer break, we would get in the car and pile in and we would drive to Maine and we would spend the entire summer with my grandparents in Maine. When I reached 8th grade, my parents had the opportunity to buy the home that was across the street from my grandparents' home.
Mm.
So we had this whole beautiful life by the seashore in Maine. And it was every summer, and it was the one thing that was stable. My father would try to take 1 to 2 weeks of vacation in the summer to come and be with us in Maine. And I remember very vividly him kind of descending on the routine and the fun that we would have there. And he would try to create new memories, like taking us
Mm.
fishing or taking us to the candy store to buy penny candy or taking us kayaking. But then I also remember him being so exhausted that he would sit on the couch and just fall asleep in the middle of the day and you
Mm.
couldn't wake him. There was just this kind of tension because we weren't used to having him around and we had this routine with my mom. It's so weird because I realize now it did feel like a single mom in a way.
Mm.
He would be there for like highlights, but there was always this kind of anxious tension around him being with us. Like the energy in the home was different when he was there, for sure.
So you said that you're the oldest child. How old are your younger siblings? Like how many years between?
There's 2.5 years between the next sibling, and then 3 years more between that one and the youngest one.
Mm.
I had two sisters, and it's interesting because I have witnessed when there's been some form of abuse or toxicity in the home that siblings band together, right? They form this alliance. I don't know how this worked, but what I found was the abuse and the stress of our home actually divided me and my siblings. It was this kind of mentality of every man for himself. I was the one to receive the brunt of the abuse. I remember very vividly my youngest sister going and hiding under her bed to protect herself. I am sad to say that I was not a very good big sister. There was absolutely a division, almost a blaming of each other between the sisters. It really divided us growing up. And even to this day, we're very distant. And that's hard because I would love for that to be different.
Yeah. And you think that the dynamics with your dad played a role in that?
I think that it was a huge factor, huge, because there was this mind game of, I'm going to throw this other person under the bus so that I don't deal with the wrath. My mom is a very passive person, almost timid. So her way of dealing with it was to stand by and watch it happen. She wouldn't like step in when my father got out of control. She would just step back and witness it.
What did it look like when your father got out of control?
It looked like him getting in my face, at times being so close to my face that I could feel the spit from his words, and some very abusive name calling. I would repeat some of it, but I don't think that's appropriate. But what was really bizarre about it and what was so confusing was he would have these explosive rages, and then it was like a switch would flip, and then he would tell you how wonderful you were and how much he loved you and how you're beautiful and you're amazing. But how does a child regulate that? Like when you're called like a slut or a whore or what names like that, like when you're called that and then a moment later told that you're beautiful and you're wonderful and you're loved, it was very confusing. I think what added to the challenge was once I reached early teens, my dad became a bishop for the Mormon Church, which is the equivalent of a pastor or a preacher.
Okay.
So we would go to church on Sundays and people would approach me and say, "You are so lucky. Your dad is amazing." And what do you say to that? Because his external appearance was charming and very charismatic, knew how to talk to people, was super successful in his career, well known in the church because he was a bishop. So everything that was happening behind closed doors was just shrouded in secrecy. If I'm being very transparent, this podcast is the first time that I have been this open about what that was like.
Gosh, thank you so much for that. I think vulnerability, though, breeds connection, and there's got to be someone out there who needs to hear this. And
Mhm.
that's why it's coming out. It must have been really confusing having that dichotomy. And part of you maybe felt like you had to keep up the facade too.
100%. I remember having gatherings at our house during the holidays, and we would be in our little matching Laura Ashley dresses, and we would stand by the piano and we would sing for the company that came. There was just this facade that we were this all American, amazing family with three cute little girls that dressed in their matching dresses. It's interesting because I'm 46 years old, and even now, I still fear my father.
Wow. Did you have a sense when you were doing these performances that it was a show, that it was fake?
I think internally I did. I think that's where the anxiety came from. When I look back on it now, I think the anxiety came from knowing that this wasn't right, but not
Mm.
feeling like there was anything I could do about it. I felt threatened. I felt scared. It was really confusing because when he was in a space of being loving, he was amazing. One memory that really stands out, because he was big in the corporate world, he did a lot of TV interviews.
Mm.
And when you do TV interviews, you get your makeup done. He came home one time and told my sister and I, "Get ready. I'm going to take you to the store." He took us to a MAC makeup store and we learned how to do our makeup. And he bought us all this new makeup. And it was like a beautiful memory. So I would have these memories of him doing these extravagant, like different things that were loving. But I never knew when I was going to see that other side of him.
Mm.
I never knew when the grenade was going to go off. So it
Yeah.
left me in a state of confusion, really.
Yeah.
It manifested in anxiety.
Yeah. Because anxiety is worrying about the future.
Yes.
So interesting to me that it wasn't just about looking perfect in the little Laura Ashley dress. It was about somehow putting on a performance that met a standard that you really didn't know what the standard was going to be or how long it was going to last.
And I think another part of the confusion was with the religion. I think there was part of me that didn't understand what was my parents' way of doing things and what was like the Mormon belief system, right? Because
Mm.
Mormonism is very patriarchal and our home ran like that. I spent a tremendous amount of time at church. I mean, every Sunday we were in church for 3 hours. When I was in high school, every single morning, 5 days a week, I went to Bible study before I would go to regular school. We had weekly nighttime activities with youth group. My whole world revolved around the religion and the practice of it,
Mm.
which was very regimented, very
Mhm.
demanding.
Was there a disconnect that you felt between enduring this type of abuse in your home and also the message from the church of being a good person and doing the right thing?
I felt constantly conflicted
Mm.
because I grew up in a home where, I mean, we had, out of my friends, like I had the biggest home. And every time we moved, the home got bigger. And then it wasn't just the home, it was like a pool and tennis courts. And so I was raised in an environment where, as far as physical needs, there was nothing that I wanted for. In my mind, I was like, wow, I'm so ungrateful because
Mm.
I have this life that like all of my needs are met. And yet I constantly felt like I couldn't live up to the standard that was set. So it was hard. And by the time I hit my early teens and that anxiety amplified and my dad's intensity increased, I had moments of being suicidal. Yeah.
Wow. And this was in your early teens.
My early teens, I really wrestled with my mental health. There was no place to put what I felt. So my parents like put me in counseling. And I remember the therapist pulling me aside at one point and saying, "I don't know what to do to help you because I can feel that there's a problem with your father and he's not
Mm.
willing to see it." And it was like even a professional couldn't help me to navigate how to deal with my father. I mean, I now understand narcissism and I
Mm.
understand like what that is and I understand narcissistic abuse, but at the time I didn't. I just knew that I wasn't enough and it crippled me. Even things like in middle school and high school, getting dressed for school, I would obsessively try on clothes and do my hair and repeat the process of changing clothes until it felt right. Like I became very controlling of what I was doing with myself because it was
Mm.
the only way that I knew how to deal with the level of anxiety and worry that I felt all the time.
Mm.
I believe that we're all born with intuition. I believe that little children are the most intuitive beings. I feel like my intuition was telling me that something was wrong, but there was nothing I could do about it. And so it was like I had to ignore that inner voice, which I feel caused the anxiety, caused the suicidal thoughts. I just kept having this like feeling of you're so ungrateful because you have this great life and you're not happy. But I felt very different than all of my friends. I didn't have a big group of Mormon friends. I didn't live in a community where that was common. I had an earlier curfew than anyone. Like, I wasn't allowed to date. There was just a lot of control over everything I was doing. And I think it deeply impacted me, deeply.
Yeah. But that time of your life in your early teens, when you started having these thoughts about self-harm and knowing there was something wrong intuitively, but having nothing you could do about it, even a therapist telling you there was nothing you could do, you must have felt completely powerless in one aspect. And so then trying to take the power back with being controlling about your appearance and that sort of thing. I mean, how did it all manifest then once you got into your teens?
It manifested in me seeking out the attention of boys. I met my first husband when I was 14 and he was 18. My parents were very against it. He was also Mormon. He was a part of the church that I went to, and dating was forbidden. Group dating started at 16 and one-to-one dating was allowed at 18. And at 14, I was going to Bible study in the morning and he was there and we would pass notes and we would talk on the phone. And I ended up moving again, but he and I reconnected when we went to college. We went to a Mormon school out in Rexburg, Idaho. I was 18. He was 22. I got to college, reconnected with him. We got engaged really fast, which is very common in Mormon culture. Mm-hmm. And my dad lost his mind. And my soon-to-be husband and I, at the prompting of the dean of the school, who had talked to my dad and knew the danger, we ended up leaving school and we got married 3 weeks later. So I got married the first time exactly 2 months to the day after my 18th birthday. I had never had a job in my life. I didn't know how to pay bills. I didn't know how to be a wife. I didn't know how to cook. And what ensued was I married someone who had very similar traits to my dad. And within a very short span of time, the relationship became abusive.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
So take me back just a couple of months. So then you said your dad lost his mind and it was dangerous. What was the danger?
His threats were over the phone, because at the time I was in Idaho and he was on the East Coast, and he threatened my life if I was going to get married. I went and set up a meeting with the dean of the school to say I was scared. Mm-hmm. And the dean got on a call with my dad, and my dad, for one of the first times, used his abusive nature in a way where someone else witnessed it.
Okay.
And the dean of the school was like, the first thing you're going to do is go to the police station and file a restraining order. And the next thing you're going to do is I'm going to hand you your scholarship money in cash. And I want you to get out of town so that you're safe. It was very traumatizing and very disturbing. And yet there was something about it that felt very validating, because he had let someone else see what he was doing to me.
Yeah. Because they're very good at manipulating others. And
very much so.
Yeah. A narcissist seems very charismatic, and other people, they don't see it until they see it. Until
very
the
much
person
so.
slips up. Interesting. Wow. So you had dropped out of school then?
I did. I dropped out of school. I moved to Utah in with my soon-to-be husband's sister.
Okay.
Somehow my father found out where we were, and he called the sister's house, and I happened to answer the phone. And he basically said, "You've shamed our family, and if you're going to do this, then I want you to come home and get married and get out." And so I packed up my bags and I flew home, and I was at my parents' house for 3 weeks, and we planned a small wedding ceremony that was held at our home with just some close family members. I want to say if there were maybe 15 or 20 people there, and I had brought embarrassment to my dad, right? Mm-hmm. He was not happy with the decision. My mom was heartbroken and barely speaking to me.
Wow.
I know now that I was looking for an escape. I know
Mhm,
that now. I definitely didn't know it then. I was in love.
mhm.
I was going to create a life of my own, but it was definitely me trying to escape the toxicity of home for sure.
But then it ended up that you ended up in the same sort of toxic environment with this husband.
Yep. And with the husband, it was a lot more volatile. It started out as like mental and emotional abuse and verbal abuse, and then escalated into physical abuse. And what was interesting was we were about 2 years into our marriage. We had moved to Utah. We were living in Utah. So we had a bunch of Mormon friends and kind of building a life. I had been told by a doctor that I couldn't have kids. I had a history of endometriosis. And long story short, I got pregnant.
Mm,
The relationship escalated in toxicity once I got pregnant.
wow.
And I went through some major health concerns while I was pregnant, pretty severe. Almost lost her, almost lost me, and ended up giving birth to my oldest daughter in May of 1997. Really was struggling with my health. And my parents offered for my husband and I to move back to Maryland where they were living and move into a basement apartment in their house. I was desperate. I was desperate. I ended up moving. I said to my husband, I have to go. I can't do this by myself. I've been so sick, pregnant. I need to recover. I'm
Mhm.
going with or without you. He ended up coming with me. We drove across country in a U-Haul with a 4 month old
Oh my gosh. Wow.
from Utah to Maryland and moved into my parents' home. The very day that we moved in, the abuse escalated to the point where my husband at the time got violent and left marks on my body.
Oh,
I went to my father and showed him the marks, and he basically said, "You made your bed, now lay in it." I started down a path of self destruction. I was 22 years old. I had never had alcohol in my life. It's very forbidden in the Mormon Church. I started drinking, self medicating,
mm,
self sabotaging. I was in school and working at the time, but when I had free time, it was destructive. I was plummeting.
wow. So you had a little child, a baby. And how long was this period where you were in the downward spiral?
It happened really quickly. I would say probably about a year. And then finally, it got to a point where my husband and I split, and I filed for divorce and became a single mom of a little 2 year old girl. Then something really mind blowing happened. I ended up moving out of my parents' home into a townhouse in the same town that my father owned and said, "Let's have you live here while you're going to school and whatever." I'll never forget it. I was at home and I tried to call my mom. Remember, she's a stay at home mom, right? I tried to call her and she didn't answer. I had this intuitive sensation that something was really wrong with my mom. It was like this cold feeling that went through my whole body. I decided to put my little girl in the car and drive over to my parents' house. And I want to say at the time, remember, I've talked about my dad trying to build this successful career. He had just landed a job. I'm just going to say out west because I don't want to reference the company, but he
Okay.
had just landed a major role with a company that was going public and he was going to be the CEO of this company. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
And it was an opportunity that was going to make him a billionaire.
Okay.
So he was traveling a lot back and forth. My mom was spending a lot of time alone in Maryland, but something was wrong. I knew something was wrong. And I put my little girl in the car and I drove to my mom and dad's house, and my mom wasn't home. So I called my dad, like from the house phone at my parents' house. And I was like, "Dad, like, I don't know what's going on with mom, but something is telling me something's wrong." And he goes, "Talk to your mom." And he hangs up on me. And I'm like,
Oh.
okay. So I sit down in the living room and I heard the garage open, and my mom came walking in, and she was dressed in what I would call her church clothes. Like she was in like a dress shirt and a skirt, and it was a weekday. So it was weird to see
Mm,
her dressed up. And in my mind, I remembered that she had a mammogram the week before. So I was thinking, is it cancer? Like the sensation was so dark that I thought something very serious is wrong. My mom came walking in. She was pale, and she sat down in the chair next to me, and she said, "Your father left me."
Mm.
And I was like, "What?" She's like, "I just went to church, and our current bishop of the church received a fax from your dad, and he's leaving me."
So he notified the church and the church notified your mother.
Yes. And I remember just thinking, like, just total confusion. I had never really seen my parents fight as much as my dad was controlling and abusive to us. He was never that way with my mother, ever. I never saw him treat her with anything but love and respect. I never saw them really argue. Like, they might have a petty disagreement, but I never really saw them fight. What ensued over the coming weeks was my father, it turned out, was having an affair with the head attorney of this company. Not only did he leave my mother, but he left the Mormon Church. So now you have this man who has been instilling these values into you and saying, this is the only way to live and this is what you have to do. Here I am at 22, and it's like everything that I had been taught was a lie. It was such a shock to my system, and very quickly I became the mom of the family. My mother lost a bunch of weight. She was struggling to get out of bed. My youngest sister had just gone off to college and had been sexually assaulted and was suicidal and crippled with her anxiety. My father was out drinking and partying. And this is a man that I had never even seen drink a cup of caffeinated coffee, let alone drink alcohol. And he would randomly call me at different hours of the night, drunk and ranting. It was so confusing and so jarring because I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't put the pieces together. And I had a little girl. I was trying to co-parent with my ex-husband. I was back in college. I was trying to take classes. I was working at a dental office, and my whole world was turned inside out. Yeah.
Everything you knew,
Yes.
blown to pieces. As imperfect as what you knew was, now even this isn't
Yeah.
real.
Yeah. It was significant. During that time, I met a guy and fell in love. I got pregnant, and I found this bond with this man that I had really never felt before. What I didn't know was he had a history of substance abuse. Because I was so unfamiliar with addiction. I mean, I wasn't raised in an environment with alcohol, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know what that looked like. But a few months later, got married while I was pregnant. And then a couple months after that, welcomed our son in 2001. We had a health scare with him when he was born that was traumatic, but it almost bonded us more. The health issue with our son and all of the residual stuff that was happening with my family caused me to suffer with some extremely crippling postpartum depression. So our marriage was tested like right in the beginning with my mental health. I was in and out of the hospital several times because I was in darkness after our son was born.
And how old were you then?
Let's see. I was in my mid-20s, I would say. It took a while to get my hormones regulated and get the right doctor involved. It did eventually happen. And then we decided to have another son 2 years later. During that time, I was a stay-at-home mom with 3 little kids, and I stopped going to school and focused on my family. As I did that, my husband took on more and more of the financial responsibility and was trying to build his career. We had 3 little kids, and he really struggled, and he would come home at night. First, it was with like a 6-pack, then it was a 12-pack, then it was a whole cube. Pretty soon, the drinking was excessive, and he was never violent. He was never harmful to us. He was harmful to himself. During that time, I had always wanted to be a hairdresser. From the time I was a little girl, I loved hair. I started exploring going to beauty school and made the decision with 3 little kids that I was going to go to night school and become a cosmetologist. I was 6 weeks into beauty school when my husband and I split due to his addiction. And so I was putting myself through beauty school as a single mom with 3 little kids.
Wow. That was a tough time. But were you feeling some sort of hope and inspiration because you were,
Oh my gosh.
yeah, you had like a goal.
I tell people all the time, when I walked into that beauty school, it was like the heavens opened up and the angels were singing. Like
Okay.
I knew that I had found my purpose. There's something so beautiful about the process of putting your hands on someone and giving them the gift of self-confidence and self-love through your work.
Yeah.
I found that passion just exploded. What unfolded was a very successful career in the beauty industry for me.
That's wonderful. This was in your 30s?
Yep, it was in my 30s.
Were you single the whole time?
I was single for a while. Then I met my third husband. Ironically enough, I went to beauty school with some of his family members and they set us up on a blind date.
Okay.
We dated for quite a while. I think I still had it ingrained in me that I wasn't complete if I wasn't married. We ended up moving in together. He was amazing with the kids. While I was navigating my career in the beauty industry, he asked me to marry him. I got married for a third time because
Wow.
that always fixes things.
Yeah. Maybe it'll take this time.
I look at it now and I have so much perspective that I didn't have then, right?
Yeah.
I just believed that I had to create this family dynamic. I didn't have the family unit foundation in my own home, and I wanted to create that for my kids. So I ended up then, the man that my third husband had never been married, never had kids. And we made the decision to try for a baby. I got pregnant and I had a miscarriage. And then a couple short months later, I got pregnant with my little girl, who's 9 now. She was like a beautiful bonus. It was like my family finally felt complete with her here. So sadly, I battled postpartum depression again. We had some issues in our marriage. We ended up splitting when our daughter was like 7 months old.
Oh,
As crazy as this sounds, that's when the story really gets interesting.
bring it on.
I was at work one day in the salon, and I worked with one other hairdresser, and she happened to be on vacation. And the advantage to having the salon to myself was that I could multitask. So I had 2 clients in 2 separate chairs. It was my third child, my son, Aiden. It was the day of his 5th grade graduation. And so I had taken off long enough to go to his 5th grade graduation. His birthday was right around this time as well. So we were celebrating and kissed everybody goodbye, went back to work. When you're multitasking like that and you have 2 clients with color on their head, you're not exactly answering the phone.
Right.
The phone rang a couple of times and I didn't answer. Next thing I know, in the door of the salon comes my other son and my daughter's boyfriend. And they're both white as a sheet. They said there's been an accident. What I came to find out was that my son had been riding a bike in the neighborhood. He was not wearing a helmet. He was hit by a car. I rushed to the scene. We were airlifted to Baltimore to a major hospital. He had snapped his femur in half. So the femur is the largest bone in the body and the strongest bone in the body. His was snapped in half. Thankfully, he didn't have any head injuries. It was a miracle. But I want you to remember the husband who fathered these 2 boys and I were at the hospital together watching our son battle this major issue. Somehow it started like a reconnection between the 2 of us. Through that time, through that trauma, we rekindled our relationship. He had been in recovery for several years, had been working very hard to be sober. We rekindled and nursed our son back to health, it was scary, but he made a full recovery. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had the fairy tale. I had spent a lot of years being angry with God. I had walked away from Mormonism completely. I had spent probably 10 years not setting foot in a church. My husband and I, he wasn't my husband at the time, but he was my ex husband. We started attending church together, not Mormon church, just a non denominational Christian community church. We both separately, unbeknownst to each other, had started running to get healthy. So when we got together, we started running together. I like to say at that point, I was just approaching 40.
Mhm.
I was in the most aligned space I had ever been in my life. I was physically the healthiest I'd ever been. Mentally and emotionally, I felt like I was in a really solid relationship. Our kids were thriving and my business was booming. I felt like I had finally found my happy ending. He ended up asking me to remarry him. We bought our dream home in the country. It was beautiful. It was powerful. I had a deep faith in God and a deep connection with God. I had what I thought was the happy ending that I had been striving for so long.
Yeah.
I think what people don't realize until you're in it is that every single person in the family dynamic, in the family unit, plays a role. So my husband and I got remarried and we're living this blissful life and we're serving in our local church and my business is booming and my kids are healthy. My second child, Dylan, was the only word I can think of to use is like the all-American boy, like good looking, charming, charismatic. He was an athlete. He was a starting lineup of the football team. Girls flocked to him. He had everything going for him. He had everything going for him. He started to experiment with drugs and alcohol. And I knew something was wrong, right? But this day and age, especially when your kids start driving and they have their independence, it's hard to really know exactly what they're doing. 4 years ago, in January of 2019, he researched online how to get high off of household substances. And he overdosed in our home in the middle of the night. It was one of the scariest things that I have ever experienced. We took him to a hospital. There was nothing they could do but monitor him. We had him in and out of rehab facilities trying to get him sober.
What kind of household substances was he experimenting?
He did something called robo-tripping. So you use like Robitussin, like cough medicine, along with some other cocktail. I'm not exactly sure of what he even used.
We don't need to give the recipe.
Right. So it started this downward spiral. 4 months later, he had a girlfriend who both her and her family were not the greatest influences. The mother of this young girl, who was only 16 at the time, thought that it would be a great idea for her to offer for my son to move into her home so that he could live with them because we weren't getting along, which was crazy. He ended up moving in with them. Then he had some kind of an argument with his girlfriend. I won't get into the specifics of it.
Yeah.
And he decided on April 18th, 2019, that he was going to take his own life. And so he went out on a country road in the town that we live, and he drove his car into a tree at 100 miles an hour. That day, on that very country road, there happened to be an off-duty Baltimore City firefighter who was at a house cleaning windows for his wife's cleaning business. He heard my son's car go flying past on the road, and he knew the sound when the car cracked against the tree. He knew from his training that something had happened. So he jumped in his Toyota 4Runner, drove down to the scene of the accident. My son was only breathing 1 to 2 times per minute. He stabilized his airway and he pulled out his phone to try to call 911, and there was no service. So he ran up the hill of the road, called 911. And when he turned around, my son's car was on fire. And he happened to have a fire extinguisher in the back of his truck. And he put out the fire. While all of this was happening, I was living my life. I had gotten up that morning and I had gone to a nail appointment that I had every 2 weeks. Mitzi, my phone never rang. My phone never rang. And I got home and my salon space was in my house in the basement. And I walked down the steps. And as I got to the second to last step, I got a text message from my husband that just said 911. And we don't ever do that. So I knew something was serious. And I called him and he said, Dylan's been in an accident and they're telling me he hurt his knee, but they're telling me we have to get to the hospital right now. I was like, okay. I just went into automatic pilot. A friend of mine happened to be at the house that day, helping me organize some things in my salon and decorate and do some things. I got in her car and we immediately drove to the high school to pick up my other son. So this son was 15 at the time. Mm-hmm. And we pull up to the high school and there's a motorcade of police cars. My son is standing outside the school with the principal and these police officers. So clearly they knew something I didn't, but I couldn't, in my shock, I couldn't register it. And so my son gets in the car silent and the police offer to do an escort for us to get to the hospital. And I knee jerk just said no. I don't even know why I said no, but I was just like, no, we don't need that. In my head, my son hurt his knee. I think I was in shock. I was in denial, right? Because they obviously knew it was serious, but I couldn't process it. So we got in the car, we drove to the hospital, and I remember walking in the doors of shock trauma, and there were all of these people there, people that I knew that were waiting. I'm like, how do all these people, it was so confusing, right? And this surgeon comes out into the waiting room and he said, I need to speak to the mother of Dylan Brown. I just raised my hand. And he guided me to a bench and he sat me down and he said, your son is gravely injured. And he started rattling off this list of injuries. He had severed one carotid artery. His other carotid artery was only functioning at 35%. He had broken his elbow, shattered his knee, broken his shin. He had heart damage. He had lung damage. He had damage to his spleen, possible damage to his liver. And he was just rattling off all of these injuries. And I remember looking at him and just seeing his bushy eyebrows and thinking, gosh, he needs to trim those. I couldn't handle what he was saying to me.
Yeah.
We then proceeded to spend a dramatic amount of time in the hospital. But what ensued for me was a series of some of the most profound spiritual experiences that I'll probably ever have in this life.
Wow. So how long was Dylan in the hospital?
It's hard to know the timeline anymore because it's all such a blur, but it was several months. He was in a medically induced coma. And when you're in a medically induced coma, the idea is to allow the brain, he had a traumatic brain injury and a brain bleed. Mm-hmm. The idea is that you use medication to settle the brain so that it can heal. But then what the doctors do is they will ease the medication and allow the person a few moments of wakefulness in periods of time, slowly in increments, to allow them to process. And my son was fully intubated, meaning he was doing no breathing on his own. Yeah. He had a trach, he had a chest tube, he had the whole thing hooked up to machines. And I remember having the conversation around a round table of all of these experts, different doctors. He had a doctor for his heart, he had a doctor for his lung, he had a doctor for his brain injury. There were this whole team of doctors working, and the conversation ensued about donating his organs. If we can't save him, do you want to donate his organs? That's where we were. And it changed my life, because what I didn't say about all of this, working as a hairdresser and putting my hands on people, I could always sense what was going on with my clients when I touched them. And I believe that was a huge part of what made me so successful in my career, was that I had intuitive abilities that I wasn't saying I was intuitive, but I was using my intuitive abilities with people for years behind the chair. I decided, as I was exploring religion and spirituality, I decided to get certified as a Reiki practitioner. I started doing oracle card intuitive readings for some of my clients, but I shrouded it in secrecy because my church friends frowned upon intuition and intuitive ability. And so I was very secretive about who I would do readings for. And the only people who could reach me for a reading, you had to know someone and be referred by word of mouth. So I was in this deep space of like spiritual expansion and definitely like tapping into that part of me. But in going through this process with my son, I had some very profound spiritual experiences. And one of those was our community like rallied around us. I mean, we had people cutting our grass and bringing us meals and helping with childcare and helping with parking. And you know what I mean? Like just this influx of love and support. And one of the things that we got a lot of was we got like well wishes, like greeting cards. Our mailbox would just be filled with cards from people all over who were reaching out with well wishes. And one of the cards that we received was from one of my clients' neighbors who had gone and visited Lebanon. And she had come back with some consecrated oil from the Saint Charbel, who was a healer in the 1800s. I don't remember getting this card, and I don't remember setting it aside or anything like that. But we went to the hospital one day, and I walked to the door of my son's room, and he was by himself. Like, no one else was in there. And the nurse had told me that he had been spiking a fever of 106, 107, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. They were saying like, it's the traumatic brain injury. His body's having a hard time regulating temperature. So I walked to the door of his room and I watched the machines like moving his chest, breathing, and the lights were off. And I heard a voice say, "Get the oil." I put my backpack down and I opened it up. That card with the consecrated oil was in my backpack. I pulled it out and I walked over to my son's body. I just remember saying, "Please, God." And I took the oil and I placed it over his head, placed it across his forehead and on his temples, placed a little bit by his trach. Then I used Reiki, a Reiki practice, and I placed my hands on his chest. And it was like an explosion. I ran out of his room and his nurse was right outside the room. I said, "Nora," I still remember her name, "Nora, my son has a massive infection in his chest. He needs an IV antibiotic for 3 days and it starts with a C." And she goes, "What?" And I was like, "I need you to call the doctors." I go back into my son's room and I sit down next in the chair next to his bed. And I was like, "Oh my God, Stacey, what have you done? What have you done?" My phone rings and I pick it up and it's one of the head surgeons. And she's, "I'm going to be honest with you. I just got done a really long surgery and I'm exhausted, but I understand you have questions about your son." I said, "I don't have questions. I need you to come look at him right now. He has a massive infection in his chest." Within 15 minutes, his bed was surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses. His right lung was completely filled with fluid. His left lung was almost completely filled with fluid. He had a massive infection in his chest. And the next day, when we went into his room, there was the IV antibiotic hanging on the bag on this pole next to his bed that started with a C. And the doctor approached me, another doctor approached me, and he was like, "You know, you're weird, right?" Kind of joke. And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "But your weirdness saved your son's life."
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's unbelievable. Was that the first major experience like that that you'd had?
I had experiences throughout my childhood, especially when I was suicidal, where I would have these close encounters with God. And I had definitely had those experiences where I knew I was intuitive, but it was like ignoring it. But that was the most profound,
Mm.
but it didn't stop there. We don't often think of the hospital as being a spiritual place, but I want everybody to think about it. When you go to the hospital, you're in a portal where lives are coming into the world, babies being born,
Mm.
and lives are leaving the world, losing their lives.
Yeah.
So we don't think about that, right?
No, but that's
But
so true.
it's so
Such a good
true.
point. Such a good point.
And so on one day, we were at the
Wow.
hospital and my son's medicine from the coma, they eased the medicine and he couldn't speak. He could just mouth words because he had a trach. Okay. And so they woke him for a short period of time and he asked to see the pastor from our church. He mouthed the words that he wanted to see the pastor of our church. So we went home that night, like we did every night. We made arrangements for the pastor to come to visit him the next day. My husband and I got into bed. Mitzi, I don't remember falling asleep. I feel like I was totally awake. I could hear my husband deep breathing next to me that he was asleep, right? I'm laying in bed, and my son, who's in the hospital, comes walking into my room. I can tell you what he was wearing. He had on a gray sweatshirt. He had on his skinny jeans. He had on his Nikes. He sat on the end of our bed and he flipped his baseball cap, his white baseball cap backwards. He said, Mom, I don't know what to do because I've seen this. And I looked to where he was pointing. It was the corner of my room. And there was this vibrant white light. I think it was God. Like that's how it was. The message came to me. And on one side was my husband's grandfather. And on the other side was my grandfather. And then he looked at me and he was like, and if I stay, I have a huge mess to clean up. Then he looked at me like asking me what he should do. And I said, it's not up to me. Then he was gone. And I woke up the next morning and my husband got out of bed and I said, I've got to tell you what just happened to me last night. I was so peaceful. Like I can't even describe how calm I was. It was a peace that surpasses understanding. I just was so calm. And I recounted to my husband what happened. And the second that I did, he collapsed next to the bed and he was like, oh my God, our son is going to die. He asked to see the pastor of the church and then he appeared to you. He's going to die. And we got in the car, I mean, we rushed to get ready and I couldn't calm him. And we got to the hospital and the pastor and his wife were there. And as we're walking into the hospital, I heard Dylan's voice say to me, Mom, send dad in and I'll prove I was in your room. And I was like, I must be losing my mind. I'm on a city street and I'm hearing my son's voice in my head. And I'm like, I must be losing my mind. And I blurted out to Mike, I said, I need you to go into his room when they wake him and ask him if he was in our room. I need you to go in and ask him if he was in our room and he's going to confirm it to you. And so there I stood in the waiting room with the pastor and his wife, trying to awkwardly explain this intuitive, powerful vision message that I got. They're looking at me like I'm crazy. I'm thinking I'm crazy. My husband goes back into our son's room and he comes out 15 minutes later and he's got tears streaming down his face. And he was like, I asked him in two different ways and he said he was in our room. I was like, I told you he was in our room. And we ended up leaving the hospital and going home again that night. It was like 11 o'clock at night and the phone rang and it was the hospital. And I picked up immediately. And the nurse was like, everything's okay. I don't want you to be scared, but something weird just happened. We woke Dylan up again for a short period of time and he insisted that we call you. And he just keeps mouthing one phrase over and over again. I was upstairs. I was upstairs. I was upstairs.
It's just amazing.
I don't know why I was given those messages, but it sent me on a path that changed me so significantly because, like I said, I had intuitive impressions before. I had had experiences like that, but I had never on this level experienced this kind of spiritual connection. And it changed my entire life. because my son healed and he came home from the hospital. He continued to battle addiction. My life was ravaged. I stopped taking care of myself. I sustained on bags of double stuffed Oreos instead of running.
Oh,
I stopped doing hair because I was caring for my son. Then I had to have a major surgery of my own that I ended up suffering with some complications. When I tried to go back to life the way it was before, I wasn't the same.
when was this? What year were we talking about?
This has been about 3 years. So the crash was April 18th of 2019.
Yeah.
And about a year and a half later of coming out of that, I just wasn't the same person.
Yeah. Yeah.
It changed everything. I was being led on a path that I was meant to show up in the world differently.
Yeah.
I went on a deep journey of self-discovery and self-love, and really began to understand my programming and why I was the way I was. On the deepest level, having this radical self-acceptance that I had never had before. I was introduced right at the beginning of COVID to a beauty brand that allowed me to make some money while I wasn't seeing hair clients. I started getting on camera every day on Facebook Live and doing makeup tutorials and publicly pulling cards for people.
Ah,
But the beautiful thing was, while I was encouraging women to love themselves, I was looking at myself in the camera. And so I started being more public about who I am and what I could do. And then I was introduced to a social media app that's an audio app called Clubhouse.
Mm.
I started publicly sharing some of my journey and what I had been through with my son, and very vulnerably. It almost started a movement because I started my own club called Soul Center. I started having discussion rooms where people could come and share vulnerably and openly. But I also started doing readings for people on Clubhouse. I began meeting people from all around the world. Within a couple short months, I decided to go meet some of those people in the UK. And having never met them in person before, but only dealing with them on a social media app, I went completely out of my comfort zone, having never traveled much before. I flew to the UK for the first time and met some of these people in person. One of them that I met became a very dear friend and was also very spiritual and intuitive. We started collaborating and navigating this new season. I felt the prompting that I was meant to write a book. This gentleman helped me with that process. His name is Nimesh, very good friend of mine. As I was on this journey to self-discovery and healing, I often tell people that the day that my son crashed his car into a tree, it was like he put the whole family in the car with him.
Oh,
We all came out with different injuries. We all came out with a different timeline for healing.
yeah.
Unfortunately, my injuries and my husband's injuries didn't have the same timeline for healing. So while I was on this journey to self-discovery and writing a book and using my voice and helping people, my husband was plummeting in a different way. And we have since decided to end our marriage. So it's been life-changing.
Yeah.
But for the first time in my entire life, I know that I am showing up in the world exactly the way that I'm meant to, that I no longer live in a space of acting out of guilt and shame, that I'm doing what I'm meant to do and serving other people
Mhm.
in a significant way.
Yeah. Yeah. This has been quite a journey.
It's been really mind-blowing. And it was very, very hard to write the book
Mhm.
because I had to, like, when we're talking about things right now and I'm giving you the timeline, I'm talking about all of it and it's a lot. But when you're writing a book, you have to relive in detail all of the experiences because you have to give the reader the feeling that they're there in the experience, that with all their senses. So to relive and reconnect with some of these extremely traumatic things, it was very challenging. But I had this vision in my head the whole time I was writing the book of this woman somewhere between the age of 35 and 55. Okay. She's in that window somewhere. And she's got brown hair, like shoulder length. And I can see her in like jeans and a jacket. And she's like not showered. She's going through this like crisis in her life.
Mm.
And she wanders into a bookstore out of desperation because she just wants to find something to connect with to help her.
Yeah.
I picture her walking into the bookstore and she goes through the religious section and she's searching for something. I just need to know like how to get through this. She searches and nothing's there. And she goes to like self-help and nothing's there. She goes to spirituality and her finger grazes the bookshelf and she stops right at my book. And she pulls it off the shelf and she opens it up and she finds somebody that she can connect with.
Yeah.
I think about that woman every day through this process.
Yeah.
With my book, I didn't just tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of each chapter, there's a life lesson, an open-ended question, journal prompt style, so that the reader is getting something out of it for themselves.
Yeah, because that's what it's all about. That's what I believe, because it's the whole point of why I believe telling your story and pulling out those lessons is so important. But I've come to understand something about the process that, and I wonder what you'll think about this, but it isn't just about going through the emotions of the past, pulling out the lessons, figuring out what they are by analyzing, but it's also that nothing is going to really change. You're not going to get through those things until you take that analysis and that evaluation and then take it a step further to create something new from it. And that's where people get stuck.
Awareness alone is not enough.
No. And you can analyze it to death and you can understand it. And then you can go back and think to yourself, why isn't it going away? I understand it now. And the reason why is because you haven't taken a corresponding action to create something new from it.
Correct.
And you have.
Yep.
In your life, you have just done this, and it's taken you all this time, but in all of these different experiences and traumas. So tell me about your intuitive work now and how that comes across in your life now.
I made the decision May 1st to leave my marriage. When I did that, I was giving up my career in the beauty industry because my business was in my home. So I left my home. I moved out. I moved into a friend's house, renting space in their basement, allowing me the opportunity to be with my daughter, my youngest daughter. I just decided to be public about what I could do. I had always been using these abilities behind the chair. I'd been using them shrouded in secrecy, but now I was like, we're blowing the lid off this. This is what I do. So I started doing readings for people locally, like in the last several years. I was already doing that, right? It had to be by word of mouth. You had to know someone. Then I went public with it on Clubhouse and said, this is what I can do. I started doing readings for people there. What's happened is like a snowball effect. I've now done readings, and I also have a mentorship program where I help people to align themselves. And I have clients from around the world. It's all been because of social media and networking. I've had clients from India, the UK, Canada, California, Texas, like all over the US. Now I spend my time completely dedicating my life to helping other people. So I thought when I was working in the beauty industry that I had to have my hands on people in order to get intuitive hits for them. But what I have found is I can sit with a person's energy and I can get those impressions. The way that I explain it to people is we see the physical body and we know that we can transform it, right? We know that we can strengthen the muscles. If you work out once a month, you're not going to see results, right? But if you work out consistently on a schedule, you strengthen your muscles, and that's when you see the results. I personally feel that my intuitive ability is the same way.
Yeah.
The more that I use it, the stronger the muscle gets and the easier it is to tap in. And so what I've found is over the course of the last couple of years, being in that space has allowed me to strengthen that muscle so that I have the ability to be on a Zoom call with someone and tap into their energy and give them a message. It has been life changing for me because I'm listening to my inner voice really for the first time ever on a consistent basis. I'm not concerned about what anyone else thinks about me or what their opinion
Mm,
is.
yeah.
I'm simply doing what I feel called to do. As I've done that, muscle has gotten stronger and stronger. Now, I mean, my schedule is full with clients that I'm helping to align with their soul's purpose,
Mm,
that I'm giving intuitive messages to, that I'm mentoring and helping guide them. It's like I had to have my whole life ravaged
yeah.
to finally be true to myself.
Yeah.
And yet I've never felt more sure of who I am than I
Mm.
do right now.
I think the process of life is astounding, the way that it does that and the way that it works.
Mhm. It's mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
Especially because I spent so many years in so much pain, really making decisions out of that space of guilt and shame.
Mm,
Now it's for the first time ever, I'm surrendering what others think of me. I'm
mhm.
surrendering my old life and I'm dedicating my life to service.
Yeah.
It's been a very painful journey to get here, but it has also been incredibly rewarding because I know that I'm showing up in the world the way that I'm meant to.
Yeah.
I know that I'm exposing who I am for the
Mm,
world to see.
yeah. You had to go through all those things in order to be who you are today.
Yeah.
So before I ask you about your biggest lessons and blessings from this incredible life that you've lived, I just am wondering what your relationship is like with your mother and your father. Are they aware of your intuitive abilities and what you're doing now with your life?
So when everything happened with my son, I went through some painful experiences with both of my parents that led me to make the decision to not have contact with them. So I have not had contact with either of my parents for almost 4 years. I don't know what's ahead,
Hmm.
as far as will they ever be in my life, but I know that the last 4 years not having them in my life has been very helpful for me in my healing journey.
Yeah.
In my book, I talk a little bit about the history with my parents, but I felt I had to be extremely careful about how I said things because, like I said, I'm still fearful of my father.
Okay.
And I didn't want him to like try to take legal action against me or
Right. Right.
anything like that. I feel like I'm still healing from all
Yeah.
of it. The way that I'm healing is by taking space from them.
Yeah.
Whether that's permanent or not, I don't know.
Yeah. It's understandable. Yeah.
As
S-
far as them being aware of my intuitive abilities, I don't even think my parents know who I am, let alone about my intuitive abilities.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that
Yeah.
because I believe that they did the best they could with what they had.
Mhm.
And I really don't hold anything against them. I just want to be able to live my life.
Yeah. That's the graceful way of looking at that situation. It's so big of you to be able to do that. So, what are the most important lessons that you have learned?
I believe, and this is probably going to sound crazy, but I believe that I have learned the secret to life. I believe that that is that we are meant to love ourselves, to truly love and embrace who we are. I believe that when we love ourselves, we trust ourselves.
Do we find out who we are when we love ourselves?
I believe so. I believe that when we love ourselves, we trust ourselves. And when we trust ourselves, we listen to our intuition. And I believe that
Mm,
we're meant to learn to love ourselves so that we can then go and love other people. Because
mhm.
ultimately, when we love ourselves, we have the ability to love other people.
Yeah.
I believe that we're put on this earth to be loving beings and to serve one another.
Mhm.
So I would say that's probably the biggest lesson that I've learned. Then I would say the other lesson that I've learned is that when we give up our idea of what we think our life should look like for what God has intended, that's when the magic happens.
Is that part of why it's important to listen to your intuition?
100%. I
It's
think a
the
lot of
inner
us,
voice where
yeah,
you find that connection to spirit or
yep.
whatever
And
you
I think a lot of,
want to
I
call
think
it.
we all have it. That's the
Yeah.
thing. I think we all have it,
Yeah.
but I think there, a lot of
Well,
us go through life circumstances that squelch it.
yeah.
Right?
And then also, like you said, you heard your son's voice coming through you and you thought you were crazy. That's what people do. They think if they get some thought in their mind that they question the thought or the gut
Mhm.
feeling, they question it
Yep.
and they think they're crazy.
Yep.
Because that's a societal, I guess, message that we have. Maybe
It's
I don't know
crazy.
how to dig into that. So what about the blessings? What are the most important blessings in your life?
The biggest blessing is I know that my kids are getting a healthier mother today than they've ever had. I know that I have formed a closer relationship with some of my kids. Not all right now, we're still hurting. But I've formed a closer connection with them than I've ever had before. And I think in embracing my story and saying, okay, I'm not going to hide who I am. This is who I am. I feel like the blessing of the book is that the message will live on beyond just a moment of an experience happening for me.
Mhm.
There's like a documentation of this blessing. And I feel like the book has been a huge blessing because it's been therapeutic, it's been a release, but
Yeah.
it's a long-standing message that whether my kids are ready to read it now or not, they'll have that at some point when they decide that they're ready.
Yeah. I have one more question, but before then, this is the perfect place for you to just tell us the title of the book and where people can find it.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Journey to Soul Center: Discovering the Gift of Surrender. It is available now on Kindle, on Amazon. It will be available on Audible.
We'll have all the links for everyone in the notes, so you'll be able to get the book. Now, the last question I have for you, I want to know what you think is your gut reaction when someone asks you, what is the most important thing?
The most important thing is to be true to yourself, no matter what. It is the most important thing. Because without being true to yourself, you can't really show up in the world the way you're meant to. And you can't really have the loving relationships that you want or need surrounding you. So the most important thing is to be true to yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Stacey. This has been an incredible story. I'm so grateful for your vulnerability and your willingness to be so open with us in sharing all of these things. And I know that this is going to reach all the people who are meant to hear it, and people are going to buy your book and be touched, and lives will be changed.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real blessing to share time with you.
Thank you.